sort of like your online voice started like through blogging and talking about Scottish independence, but now that you're entering sort of more international level of notoriety, you're talking more about class. But I'm assuming that when you were talking about independence, class was a big component. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I came into a position of conflict with sections of the Yes movement, because, you know, like all movements, there's a disagreement in certain pockets about what the priorities are and what posture we should assume generally. So it was the sort of, for me and a lot of other people on the kind of left and the radical left, we didn't really buy into the idea that independence first and then we'll talk about all the stuff later. We thought, no, hang on, why go to all this trouble of having independence if we've not got a really certain idea of what we want to do in relation to taxation, social housing, welfare, drug policy, education. Like, let's really get into the detail about this stuff, because that might be the thing that mobilises more people in the disenfranchised communities who are, you know, usually apathetic towards politics, and for good reason. So I would be bringing up class, usually in relation to art, because I was creating music around the themes that I thought were sort of emerging out of the independence debate. And sometimes I would come into conflict when I would go and perform at arts events that were like felt very sort of studenty and middle class, and there's a certain expectation about what's appropriate. You'll know this from your experience as a performer, although because you're more established now, people will tend to come to wherever you are on issues. But when you're just meeting people for the first time and you're using a vernacular and a lexicon and things that might be perceived as vulgar or aggressive, then you just feel resistance. And for me, that raised interesting questions, because one of my primary interests in independence was that the regionalisation of culture in Britain means that a lot of great writers and artists from, you know, different places in the UK who don't have friends in the sort of London bubble, they just get ignored, or they're seen as kind of like firebrands, or they get bracketed in a certain way. And so I thought independence is, perhaps selfishly, I thought independence is a way for us to create our own culture and our own, and configure it in a way that makes sense to us. But then there was a lot of self-interest involved as well. In hindsight, you know, it was this idea of being a bigger fish in a smaller pond. You know, I've been rapping for 15 years, and I'm very competent at it. I'm very passionate about it. But even in Scotland, the idea of rapping with my own accent is like a joke for a lot of people. And that's even worse when you go down south, you know, although all the grime rappers and all the MCs down there, there's a very proud history of UK hip hop. So it's just like all of those reasons. But then when I got into the discussions with people who were running these arts events, and I was wanting to talk about class, or I had class-based disputes with them, then they were like, we'll talk about this later. We'll talk about this after. And they would try and placate me in various ways, obviously underestimating how passionate I was about it. So that became a sort of a divergence point for me and a lot of other people with the Yes movement that still remains to this day, I would say.
What is the nature of this dispute? What is the nature of this disparity between what I'm picking up you're describing as more educated, or to use a classical or conventional word, the more bourgeois aspect of the left and the working class contingency?
Yeah, and then also
what is this dispute?
Also a nationalist fold at the centre of it all as well. So it's not. I wouldn't characterise it as a dispute, although it does manifest as confrontation and acrimony. I would characterise it as things getting lost in translation. So we currently think about culture as a sort of continuum where people near the bottom are waiting to sort of graduate to become legitimate by virtue of their willingness to either conceal or renounce those traits which indicate who they actually are.
Yes.
Whereas I see working class culture as a parallel culture, and in it there are many contradictions, eccentricities, lessons. There's a lot of wisdom There are things that are very distinct. I mean, I've been socially mobile enough in my life that I've mixed a lot across the ravine. So over the years, I've built up an understanding of some of these fault lines, and the breakdown in communication often can come from simply a difference in a sense of urgency or priority, or the words that someone uses. So what you might see as passion, someone sees as aggression or pushiness, or what you might see as polite, someone thinks is patronising. Yeah. And it's the combination of all of these little instances where people come away from an attempt to mingle across the ravine that just becomes natural to sort of recoil back to where it's comfortable, where people agree. Whereas I like to be on the line. I'm more comfortable in the middle. I come from a working class background. I'm passionate about it. But even back then in my youth, there would be people trying to police how I spoke, the words that I use, the things that I was interested in, a very rigid idea about what a young man should be. And I resented that and challenged that. But then at the same time, on the other side, then even just the things that I want to talk about, the way that I want to frame it, it's changing now because I've kind of been co-signed by a few legitimate people. Now it's a bit like, oh, this way, Mr. McGarvey. But beforehand, it was very much a struggle. I had to kind of manipulate my way into middle class spheres, like stop wearing a hoodie, start wearing a blazer, wear a pair of glasses instead of a baseball cap, and learn to talk like middle class people. Where I learned that for them, that's a sort of form of currency, not necessarily being clever, but sounding clever. And the minute that I sort of picked up on that, that's when I became more socially mobile than perhaps my education would have allowed me to be.
You make some good points there. One of the things I recently learned about the way that hegemony is constructed is with the imposition of a narrative and of a language within it. And the way I learned it when I'm doing this course at university, they said that the way that the Western world, or so-called secular world, deals with Islam or Middle Eastern countries is with the assumption that there's a narrative that Islam has to go through that will conform to what post that Christian history has been through, i.e. Protestantism and Catholicism and secularization. When you were describing working class culture, then said it's a parallel narrative, that there is a separate Islamic narrative, there's a separate working class narrative, and you don't have these things needn't necessarily conflate. And certainly what you would call, I suppose, secondary or sub narratives, it can't be subsumed into the inverted commas dominant narrative. So I like that, mate, what you said, that you have to, even on the level of like the way that you accessorize, pop on a pair of specs instead of a baseball cap to be more sort of identifiable.
But then when you do that, you come into conflict with where you actually come from. You turn up at a hip hop gig in a blazer and people are like, where's your hoodie? Who do you think you are? You know? And so like actually as much as that has been difficult at times, at the same time I've kind of like I've tried to stay true to what I want to do. And really with the book, what I was trying to do was engage multiple people from multiple backgrounds at the same time.